After this event, she was often surprised to find her mother in tears, and when, in her simplicity, she inquired, "Mama, what makes you cry?" she would answer, "Oh, my child, I am thinking of your brothers and sisters that have been sold away from me," and she would proceed to detail many circumstances respecting them. But Isabella long since concluded that it was the impending fate of her only remaining children, which her mother but too well understood, even then, that called up those memories from the past, and made them crucify her heart afresh. At length, the never-to-be-forgotten day of the terrible auction arrived, when the slaves, horses, and other cattle of Charles Ardenburgh deceased were to be put under the hammer, and again change masters. At this memorable time, Isabella was struck off for the sum of $100 to one John Neely of Ulster County, New York, and she has an impression that in this sale she was connected with a lot of sheep. She was now 9 years of age, and her trials in life may be dated from this period. She says, with emphasis, "Now the war begun." She could only talk Dutch, and the Neelys could only talk English. Mr. Neely could understand Dutch, but Isabel and her mistress could neither of them understand the language of the other, and this, of itself, was a formidable obstacle in the way of a good understanding between them, and for some time was a fruitful source of dissatisfaction to the mistress, and of punishment and suffering to Isabella. She says, "If they sent me for a frying pan, not knowing what they meant, perhaps I carried them pot hooks and trammels. Then, sale she was connected with a lot of sheep. She was this, of itself, was a formidable obstacle in the way of a good understanding between them, and for some time was a fruitful source of dissatisfaction to the mistress, and of punishment and suffering to Isabella." She says, "If they sent me for a frying pan, not knowing what they meant, perhaps I carried them pot hooks and trammels. Then, oh, how angry mistress would be with me. Then she suffered terribly, terribly." She says, "I gave her plain to eat and frying pan, not knowing what they meant, perhaps I carried them pot hooks and trammels. Then, oh, how angry mistress would be with me. Then she suffered terribly, terribly with the cold. During the winter her feet were badly frozen, for want of proper covering. They gave her plain to eat and also plenty of whippings." Around 1815, she fell in love with a fellow slave named Robert, but they were forced apart by Robert's master. Isabella was instead forced to marry a slave named Thomas, with whom she had 5 children. In 1827, after her master failed to honor his promise to free her or to uphold the New York anti-slavery law of 1827, Isabella ran away. Or, as she later informed her master, "I did not run away, I walked away by daylight." After experiencing a religious conversion, Isabella became an itinerant preacher and in 1843 changed her name to Sojourner Truth. During this period, she became involved in the growing anti-slavery movement, and by the 1850s, she was involved in the women's rights movement as well. At the 1851 Women's Rights Convention held in Akron, Ohio, Sojourner Truth delivered what is now recognized as one of the most famous abolitionist and women's rights speeches in American history. She continued to speak out for the rights of African Americans and women during and after the Civil War.
May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and eat as much as it too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if women have a pint and man have a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need to not be afraid to give us our rights, for we fear you will take too much, for we can't take more than your pint'll hold." The poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you give women's rights, give it to her and she will feel better. You will have your own rights and there won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear. I have heard the Bible and heard that Eve caused men to sin. Well, if women upset the world, do give her a chance to set it right up again. The lady has spoken about Jesus and how he spurned women from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to raise their child, and Jesus wept. And Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him and women who bore him. Man, where is your part? But the women are coming up, blessed be God, and a few of the men are coming up with them. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. Women is coming up on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard.
I first learned about Sojourner while working on a project my freshman year. I thought her personal story of escaping and regaining custody of her son Peter, who was illegally sold after the New York anti-slavery law passed, was powerful and inspiring. I thought she was very eloquent in her speech and biography, and she inspired me to learn more about the women's rights movement and other strong, well-spoken women. So, when I was assigned this project in U.S. government, I immediately thought of her, and that led to this podcast of Hanai and I discussing important female rights activists. In the 19th century, the United States was rapidly changing. In the USA, the 19th century was a time of tremendous growth and change. The new nation experienced a shift from a farming economy to an industrial one, major westward expansion, displacement of native peoples, rapid advances in technology and transportation, and a civil war. The reform movements, which were in a large part driven by women, gave these women the idea that they could work on their own behalf and radically improve the state of their own lives. So, while these women were working on prison reform, education reform, and abolition, they also started talking about equal rights, universal suffrage, temperance, and fair pay. In the colonial era, most American women of European descent lived lives much like those of their European counterparts. They were legally and socially subservient to men and trapped within a patriarchal structure. Under the legal principle of coverture, husbands held authority over the person, property, and choices of their wives. Since women weren't permitted to own property and property ownership was a precondition for voting, they were totally shut out of the political process. Citizens of the new republic were therefore definitionally male, but women were still valued in regard to motherhood. Though they could not participate in the political process themselves, they raised the next generation of voters and legislators. Women, excluding slaves and the Three-Fifth Compromise, were also counted in determining the population of a state for representation purposes.
The market revolution had profound effects on American women too. Because as production shifted from homes to factories, it shifted away from women doing the production. This led to the so-called cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity, or true womanhood, was an idealized set of societal standards placed on women of the late 19th century. Piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity were the mark of femininity during this period. A woman's place was in the home, so rather than the production. The job of women was to aid their husbands by providing food and a clean living space, as well as what historian Eric Foner called a non-market value like love, friendship, and mutual obligation. Sounds kind of like a dog. Which were represented values in magazines of the 19th century, which titles like Catherine Beecher, an